The house had finally gone quiet. The guests had walked back down the lane with their lanterns swinging. The fiddle had been shut in its case, and the last of the cake had been wrapped in a cloth and set on the high shelf where the mice could not reach it. The bride stood in a room that was not yet hers, in a house whose every small sound was still a stranger's sound, and she let herself believe that the longest day of her life was finally over. She was wrong about that, though there was no way for her to know it. She had been warned about a great many things before her wedding, about her duties, about her husband's temper or his gentleness, about the price of flour and the way the chimney drew when the wind came round from the north. But no one had thought to warn her about what the valley did to a new wife after dark, and no one ever did, because it was the kind of thing you were meant to find out for yourself. Somewhere past midnight, when the lamp had burned low, and the house had settled into the ticking and creaking of a building cooling in the night, the first sound came. It was a single flat clang. An iron pot struck once with an iron spoon, and then a silence so deliberate that it was almost worse than the noise had. Then it came again, nearer, and then the whole night broke open at once. There were pots, and there were pans, and there were kettles beaten with pokers. There were cowbells and dinner bells, and the bells they took off the necks of the oxen. There were tin horns and hunting horns and whistles, and underneath it, all the long, sawing groan of a thing some of them called a horse fiddle, a board and a rosin string built for no purpose on this earth but to make a sound that set your teeth against each other. There were men's voices, dozens of them, hooting and jeering, and there was the bark of a shotgun fired into the air, and another and another. To the bride at the window it was not a celebration. It was a siege. It sounded like the end of the world arriving specifically for her, and she did not yet know the word for what was happening. And so for those first long minutes she believed, with her whole body, that she and the man she had married that morning were about to be killed. She was not going to be killed. What was outside her window had a name, and a history older than the country she stood in, and a logic that everyone in that crowd understood completely, and that she would spend the rest of her life half understanding. In the parts of America where she likely stood, they called it a chivalry. The word was a clumsy mouthful borrowed and broken off from the French, from charivari, and you could find it spelled a dozen ways by people who had only ever heard it and never seen it written. Across the ocean, in the English villages many of those people's grandparents had come from, the same thing went by the plain and perfect name of rough music. The Germans called it Katzenmusik, cat's music, which is exactly what it sounded like. The Spanish had the cencerata, named for the cowbell. The Italians had their own version, and so did the French Canadians, and so did half the settled peoples of the Western world, because the impulse behind it was not local. It was nearly universal. Wherever there were neighbors close enough to hear one another's business, and a wedding to take notice of, there was some version of a crowd in the dark, with a kettle and a grievance. The shape of it was always more or less the same. The crowd gathered after the formal celebration was over, after the respectable guests had gone home, in that vulnerable hour when the couple believed themselves finally alone. They surrounded the house. They made the most hideous noise they could assemble, out of whatever the kitchen and the barn could supply. And they kept it up, and the whole point was that they would not stop. They would not stop, that is, until they were paid. A chivalry was, at its heart, a kind of toll. The newlyweds were expected to come out, the groom in particular, and to acknowledge the crowd and to provide a treat. Money sometimes passed out by the handful, cigars for the men, cake and coffee. More often than anything else, drink. You paid your footing, as the old phrase went. You bought your way back into the good opinion of your neighbors, and once you had paid, the noise would resolve itself into something almost warm. 3 cheers for the happy couple, and the crowd would drift home satisfied and a little drunk, and the marriage would be, in some sense that mattered enormously, and that we have almost entirely lost, approved. If these are the kinds of lives you want to keep walking back into, the ones the old photographs only half explain, then subscribing is how the next one finds you. So why? That is the question that sits underneath the whole strange business, and the answer tells you more about how these people lived than almost anything else you could learn about them. Why would a community do this? Why would the same neighbors who had stood in the church that morning, who had brought gifts and eaten the cake, and wished the couple well in daylight, return after dark to terrorize them? The first part of the answer is the hardest for us to feel, because we have arranged our entire lives around its opposite. To these people, a marriage was not a private matter. It was not principally about the two people getting married at all. A marriage was a public event in the deepest sense, a rearrangement of the community itself, and the community believed it had standing to comment. A wedding took an eligible young man and an eligible young woman, two people who had been, until that morning, part of the common stock of the place, and it removed them from circulation and bound them into a new household. That household would have land, or want land. It would have children who would go to the same school and marry the neighbors' children in their turn. The couple were not embarking on a private romance. They were taking up a position in a structure that everyone shared, and the rough music was the structure clearing its throat and reminding them of the fact. "You think this is yours," the noise said. "It is also ours. We were here before you, and we will be here after, and you will not forget it on your first night." That was the meaning of the mild chivalry, the good-natured one, the one that any couple might draw simply for being young and getting married. Pay your footing, take the joke, hand out the cigars, and you had passed a small initiation. But the rough music had a second face, an older and a colder one, and it came out for couples the community did not approve of. This was where the custom stopped being a joke and became a judgment. A widow who remarried too soon after burying her husband could expect a furious chivalry, because grief too was a public matter, and the neighbors had opinions about how long a respectable woman should mourn before she let another man into her bed. An old man marrying a young girl drew the crowd like nothing else, the whole valley turning out to jeer at a match they found grotesque. A man taking a wife young enough to be his daughter, and the girl's family taking his money for it. A rich man marrying poor, or poor marrying rich. Anything that violated the unwritten arithmetic of who was supposed to marry whom could bring the kettles out, and the outsider, the bride from the next county, the next country, the woman nobody knew, the woman who had come into the valley that morning as a stranger and would now be living among them forever. She was a natural target, because the rough music was partly about teaching a newcomer where she stood, and partly about the simple fact that no one in that crowd had any particular reason to be gentle with a face they had never seen before. Underneath even that lay something older still, and it had nothing to do with weddings at all. The same crowd with the same kettles came out for other things. They came out for the wife-beater, in some places, and for the husband who let his wife beat or master him, and for the adulterer, and for the man who took up with another woman while his own wife lived. In England, this older form had its own names, the skimmington, the skimmity ride, riding the stang, and it was a darker and more pointed thing than a wedding chivalry. They would build an effigy of the offender, or compel some neighbor to ride a pole or a donkey, facing backward, through the streets, while the rough music howled around him, and the whole village watched, and the offender's own door was the last stop on the route. It was a court without a judge. It was the community sitting in judgment on a private sin it had decided was public business, and delivering its sentence in noise and shame. One of the great English novels of that century turned on exactly such a ride, and the novelist understood the custom well enough to make it kill a woman, to send her into a collapse she did not survive, because he knew that rough music aimed at a person could do far more than embarrass them. It could destroy them. There was an ingenuity to the noise that is easy to miss. A community could not buy the instruments of a rough music. It had to invent them, every time out of whatever lay around the farm, and the inventing was half the pleasure. They struck circular saw blades hung from ropes, which rang like cracked bells. They beat on the bottoms of washtubs and on sheets of tin and on the anvil down at the smithy. They built the horse fiddle, that long resigned board that groaned like a hurt animal, and the thing some of them called a Dutch concert, where every man simply made the worst sound he was able to make and held it as loud and as long as his lungs would carry it. A bull's horn, a fish horn, a tin trumpet, a whistle carved for the one night and thrown away after. The aim was never music and had never pretended to be. The aim was a sound no one could sleep through and no one could ignore, and no one could mistake for anything but what it was. And they reached it, year after year, with the contents of the kitchen and the barn. But the noise was rarely only noise, and that is the other thing the softened memory leaves out. At the punishing end of the custom, the rough music came with words, and the words were the point. A man would be chosen, or would choose himself, to stand before the offender's door and deliver a proclamation, a rhymed and ragged thing, half chanted and half bellowed, that named the offense out loud for everyone within a mile to hear. These verses had their own name in some places. They were not improvised on the night. They followed forms handed down, mocking and obscene and rough in the meter, and the crowd knew the responses and roared them back into the dark. "We are here," the verse would say in its 100 local shapes, "on account of such a man and such a woman. And here is the thing that they have done." It was an indictment read aloud. The kettles were the gavel, and the bellowed rhyme was the charge, and the shame of hearing your private life turned into a public verse and shouted at your own threshold by people you would have to meet again in. Daylight was for many far worse than any bruise. The bruises healed. The rhyme was remembered and repeated for years. And the thing those rhymes returned to, again and again, was the order of men and women. Strip away the weddings and the widows, and you find, at the oldest root of the rough music, an obsession with who was meant to rule whom inside a marriage. The fiercest of the old processions in the mother country were not for adulterers at all. They were for the household where the wife was thought to have the upper hand. The woman who struck her husband, or merely scolded him where others could hear, or was known about the parish to govern him, and the man who allowed it, who had let slip the authority a husband was supposed to hold over his own house. That was the unforgivable thing. The world turned upside down, and the community would not let it stand. The henpecked husband was hauled out as readily as any wife-beater, sometimes more readily, and made to answer for a crime that was, when you look straight at it, only the crime of not mastering his wife. The rituals announced as much in their very shape. They turned the world upside down in order to punish a world they believed had been turned upside down. The man set on the pole rode it backward, facing the tail of the donkey, because everything about him was now reversed. Men pulled on women's gowns and women's bonnets and led the procession, jeering at the house where, they cried, it was the woman who wore the breeches. The whole grammar of the thing was inversion. A community staring at a marriage it found unnatural, and answering it with a deliberate carnival of the unnatural, until the offenders were either shamed back into their proper places or driven clean out of the parish. None of this was new in the age of the photograph. The rough music was already ancient when the first of these brides was born. Churchmen had condemned it from their pulpits for centuries, and the records of the old church courts are scattered with cases of it. Parishioners called up to answer for the disorder and the obscenity and the violence of their charivaris, one generation after another, with no sign the condemnation ever did the least good. The custom outlasted the men who preached against it and the courts that fined it, because it answered a hunger neither church nor court could feed. The hunger of a community to enforce its own ideas of right and wrong directly, with its own hands, on its own neighbors, without waiting on any distant authority's leave. It had come across the water in the heads of the people who settled the valley, the way a language comes, or a recipe, or a fear, carried without anyone deciding to carry it, and it had put down roots in the new ground and gone on doing in the new world exactly what it had always done in the old. Move now to a different door in a different year. The woman standing behind this one is not a young bride. She is a widow, and she has done a thing the valley has decided it cannot forgive. She has married again. By her own reckoning, she mourned long enough. She kept the black on, kept to her house, did everything a decent woman is supposed to do with her grief. But the valley keeps a longer calendar than grief does, and the valley has judged that she has been too quick about it, that she has forgotten the dead man too easily, that a woman who has buried one husband ought to have the modesty to stay a widow and not go looking for warmth in her own bed a second time. And so the rough music comes for her, and it is not the good-natured kind. There is no cake she can hand out that will send this crowd home content, because this crowd has not come for a treat. It has come to deliver a sentence, and the sentence was passed before the first pan was struck. She knows exactly what the noise means. That is the whole difference between her and the stranger at the window across the valley. The young bride heard the first pan and thought of murder. The widow hears it and feels something colder, because she understands every note of it. And she may well have stood in such a crowd herself once, years before, banging her own kettle outside some other woman's house, never once imagining the night it would come round and stop at her own door. She understands that what they are truly punishing is not the speed of her remarriage. It is the fact of her wanting anything at all. A widower who took a new wife inside the year drew a fraction of this, a few jeers, a quick footing paid and forgotten, because a man's want was reckoned a natural thing, and a man plainly needed a wife to keep his house and raise his children. But a woman who reached for a second life, who declined to spend the rest of her days as a living monument to a man in the ground, had stepped outside the part written for her, and the rough music existed precisely to shove her back into it. This was the custom's deepest and its ugliest specialty, the policing of women, of widows and scolds, and the brides who married wrong and the wives who would not be ruled, and it is the part that survives least in the fond retelling, because it makes no charming story at all. The boys banging pans for cake make a charming story. The crowd that came in the dark to inform a grieving woman that she had no right to be happy, again does not. Both were the rough music. They were always the same custom wearing different faces, and the face it chose to show you depended entirely on what it had decided you deserved. And that is the part of this story that is hardest to tell honestly, because the custom has come down to us softened, remembered as a charming bit of frontier fun, the boys banging pans outside the newlyweds' window, all in good sport. A great deal of it was in good sport, but not all of it, and the line between the two was thin, and on the wrong night, with the wrong crowd and enough whiskey, it could vanish entirely. Go back to the bride at the window. She has understood by now that she is not going to be murdered. Someone in the house, perhaps her husband, perhaps a hired man who grew up in the valley and knows the form, has explained to her what this is. And so she watches, and the night does not end, and she begins to learn what the custom is really like from the inside, which is to say, what it is like to be its object, rather than to read about it. Afterward, they want the groom. They are chanting for him now by name, the name she took that morning, and there is an edge in it. If he is wise and the crowd is friendly, he goes out early, laughing, with a bottle in each hand and money in his pocket, and he pays, and it is over in an hour. But if he hesitates, if he is proud, or poor, or simply does not understand that paying is not optional, the crowd takes the hesitation as a challenge and settles in for the night. Now the noise is not a greeting. It is a punishment, and it does not stop, and it cannot be reasoned with, and there is no authority in the dark to appeal to, because the authority of the place is the crowd. The hours pass and the kettles never tire. And if the groom comes out angry, things can turn. They might seize him. In the rougher versions, they would take the groom from the house and carry him off, set him backward on a rail or a pole, and ride him up and down the lane on the shoulders of laughing men, until the wood bruised him to the bone. They might duck him in the horse trough or the creek in the cold of the night. They might pull him one way and bar the bride from following. Separating the couple on the one night, the whole ceremony of the day had been arranged to join them, and there was a cruelty in that which everyone felt and no one named. They might come into the house. They might wreck what they found there. Not always, not even usually, but often enough that the stories were told. And the bride, who had been warned about the price of flour but not about this, would stand and watch her husband of one day carried off into the dark by 100 strangers, and would understand that she had married not just a man but a place, and that the place had rules she had not been told, and a temper she had not been shown until the lamps were out. Somewhere in your own family, a few generations back, a night like this one may have happened to a person whose name you carry now. If a version of it survived where your people came from, a word for it, a half-remembered story your grandmother told, I would like to hear it in the comments. What the gentle version makes us forget is that the rough music sometimes killed people. The records are there, in the old newspapers and in the court files, for anyone willing to look. There are documented cases across the century and across the country where a chivalry ended in blood. A groom, pushed past endurance by a crowd that would not leave, fired into the dark and killed a man he could not see and had perhaps known all his life. A reveler, drunk and careless, with a loaded gun and a mob in the night, shot another by accident, or shot himself. A man was beaten in the carrying off and did not recover. A fire was set or started by accident, and the celebration that began as noise ended as a funeral. These were not the rule. The overwhelming majority of shivarees ended in cake and cheering and a sore head in the morning. But they happened often enough that the law took notice, and the law, faced with the custom, never quite knew what to do with it. That uncertainty is itself one of the most revealing things about the whole practice. In a society that prided itself on order, here was a recurring, organized public act that was technically a riot. 100 people committing trespass and disturbing the peace and sometimes assault, and the law mostly let it alone. Some magistrates prosecuted it, especially where it had turned violent, or where the target was a person of standing, who demanded justice. There were convictions, fines, the occasional jailing. But far more often the authorities looked the other way, because the constable was as likely as not to be standing in the crowd with a cowbell in his hand. You cannot police a community against itself when the whole community has agreed that what it is doing is right and ancient and theirs. The rough music sat in the place where the written law of the state met the unwritten law of the neighbors. And for a very long time the unwritten law won, because there were more of them, and they had been there longer, and the state was far away, and the neighbors were at the door. This is the thing to hold steady in your mind, because it is so foreign to us now. These people lived almost entirely without privacy, and they did not experience this as the loss we would feel it to be. Privacy is a thing you can only mourn once you have had it. Their houses were small, and their walls were thin, and their windows looked onto their neighbors' windows, and everyone knew within a day who was courting whom and who was quarreling, and who was in debt and who had been seen coming home at an hour she should not have been out. The community knew when a couple married, and it expected, without the slightest embarrassment, to know that the marriage had been consummated. Because a marriage that produced no children was a public failure, and a household that did not function was everyone's problem. The bride's body on her wedding night was not entirely her own affair. It was, in a way we can hardly stand to think about, a matter of common interest, and the rough music outside her window was the community's hand resting, heavy and familiar, on the door of the most private room in the house, reminding her that even here she was not alone, and never would be. There was a deliberate cruelty in the timing, too, that the bride felt in her body before she had the words to understand it. The crowd did not come at supper. It did not come while the guests were still there, and the house was lit and full of noise of its own. It waited. It waited until the couple were alone, until the lamp went down, until the one private hour the entire long public day had been built to deliver had finally arrived. The hour a marriage was supposed to become a marriage in fact, and not only in name. That was the hour the kettles chose, and many a bride went toward it, having been told almost nothing of what it would hold, sent into it through the near-total silence that respectable people kept around such matters. A silence so complete that a girl could reach her wedding night genuinely unsure of what was about to happen to her. The rough music arrived precisely then. A wall of strangers' noise pressed against the one door she most needed shut, turning the most private threshold of her life into a thing the whole valley was standing on the other side of, banging pans, and waiting to hear about in the morning. The custom found the rawest hour a person owned, and that is exactly where it set up and played. And yet, it would be a lie to tell this as only a story of cruelty, because it was not only that, and the people who lived inside it did not experience it as only that. The chivalry was also a welcome. It was the only initiation many of these communities had, the one ritual that took a couple and a stranger, and made them, by morning, neighbors. To draw no chivalry at all was its own kind of insult, a sign that you were beneath notice, that the valley did not care enough about your wedding to lose a night's sleep over it. The noise, for all its violence, was a form of attention, and attention in a hard and isolated life was not nothing. A couple who paid their footing well and took the joke in good part woke up the next, morning belonging to a place in a way they had not belonged the day before. They had been tested, and they had passed, and the test was the membership. The cruelty and the welcome were not two different customs. They were the same custom, and which face it showed you depended on who you were, and what the crowd thought of your marriage, and how you behaved when they came for you in the dark. So how does a thing like this end? How does a custom that survived for centuries, that crossed oceans and outlasted kings, finally fall silent? It did not end by being banned, though it was banned, here and there to little effect. It ended because the world that needed it went away. The rough music belonged to a particular kind of place, the small, fixed, face-to-face community where everyone knew everyone and would for life, where the neighbors were the only government that reached you and the only company you would ever have. When the railroads came and the towns grew, and the young people began leaving the valley for the cities where no one knew their names, the ground the custom grew in started to thin. In a city, your marriage was no one's business, because there was no one in the sense the valley had meant it. Your neighbors changed every year. The household down the hall could fail or flourish, and you would never know. The community that had claimed the right to comment on your wedding night simply dissolved, atomized into millions of strangers, who would never gather in the dark with a kettle, because they did not know you were getting married, and would not have cared if they had. And something else changed, slower and deeper. The very idea of what a marriage was for began to shift under everyone's feet. The marriage the rough music had policed was a public practical institution, an arrangement between families and a unit in the economy of a place. But across the same decades, a different idea was rising. The idea of marriage as a private romance, a thing between two people and no one else, sealed off from the world and answerable to it for nothing. The honeymoon itself was an invention of this new feeling, the couple slipping away alone to some place where no one knew them. The precise and deliberate opposite of the wedding night, spent surrounded by everyone you had ever met. When privacy became the thing a marriage was supposed to be made of, the rough music had nowhere left to stand. You cannot serenade a couple who have already left for the coast. You cannot remind a bride that she belongs to the valley when she has packed her trunk and gone to live among strangers on purpose, because being among strangers is now the point. It faded the way these things fade, unevenly, lingering longest in the places the railroad reached last. In the deep country, in the hill farms and the river bottoms and the old French parishes, the chivalry went on into living memory, gentler with each decade, until it was only the boys banging pans for an hour and being given a cake. A quaint thing the grandparents did. Half forgotten by the time the cars and the radios and the moving pictures finished the work the railroads had begun. There are people who could, until very recently, remember being chivalried, remember standing where the bride stood, hearing the first pan ring out in the dark, and feeling the old fear rise before they remembered to laugh. The custom did not die in a single year, and no one wrote its obituary. It simply happened less, and then rarely, and then not at all. And one generation did it, as a matter of course, and their children did it as a joke, and their grandchildren had only heard of it, and then it was a word in a book. Come back one last time to the bride at the window. The night does end, as all of them did. The noise burns itself out toward dawn. The crowd takes its cake and its 3 cheers, and drifts home down the lane it came up, and the valley goes quiet again. Truly quiet now, the birds starting in the cold light before the sun. She is still a stranger here, but she is a little less of one than she was at midnight, because the place has noticed her, and tested her, and told her in the only language it had that she is theirs now, for better and for considerably worse. She has learned the thing no one warned her about, and she will not need to be told it twice, and someday, years from now, when another wagon brings another bride up the lane to another house in this valley, she will know exactly what to do. She will find a pot and a spoon, and she will wait for the lamps to go down.